They say knowledge is light. But what happens when the light is extinguished and no one remembers where the flame once burned? Beneath the ash of history, there are voids that will never be filled. A moment suspended between centuries, where once there stood a library, not merely of books, but of dreams. Alexandria is no longer a place. It has become a symbol of what once was and is no more. What was lost there might be something humanity was never meant to lose. And if something was important enough to be burned, then who struck the match? Now, gently, step into the shadowed folds of forgotten time with deformed history, if you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear. Feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now. I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. The ancient world rarely leaves clean edges. What we know of it is filtered, partial, broken in time, like a scroll weathered by salt wind. But some absences feel too deliberate, like a silence chosen, not merely suffered. The Library of Alexandria is one such silence, too deep, too complete, too strangely convenient. How does a structure said to hold hundreds of thousands of scrolls, documents of medicine, astronomy, theology, mathematics, geography, rituals, translations of lost languages, vanish almost without a trace? The names of those who walked its marble floors have faded, but not the weight of what they might have read. That weight lingers, invisible, unprovable, but pressing, like something once sacred, now sealed. The first contradiction lies not in its destruction, but in its timeline. There was no single fire, no single night of smoke and screams. Instead, a confusion of events stretched across centuries, each erosion cloaked in ambiguity. Julius Caesar's siege in 48 BCE, when ships in the harbor burned and fire leapt to the shore. Did that fire reach the library? Some say yes. Some say only the docks. Some say the daughter library in the Serapeum was spared then, only to be destroyed later. But when? By whom? The early Christians in their purge of pagan knowledge, or the Muslim conquest centuries later when a caliph reportedly declared, "If these books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they contradict it, they are heretical." And yet, that quote is likely apocryphal, written hundreds of years after the fact. The same can be said of many sources, bias upon bias, agenda within agenda. So what, truly, do we know? Or rather, what do we choose to believe? The silence becomes more suspicious when one considers what the library was said to hold. Not just knowledge of the Greeks and Egyptians, but texts from India, Babylon, Sumer, even possibly lost Atlantean or pre-flood civilizations, if such things ever existed. Records of the earth before the last cataclysm, maps showing land masses that are now submerged, techniques of sound healing, resonant architecture, and theories of consciousness the modern world has only begun to rediscover. Could it be that the library was not simply a victim of war, but of design? Who benefits from the erasure of origins? The questions gather like dust in the corners of an abandoned room. Who entered the library in its final days? Did someone have time to remove certain scrolls, not to save them but to hide them? Could some knowledge have been too destabilizing, too revealing, too freeing? There is a strange detail found in a later text by the Roman writer Aulus Gellius. He mentions a scholar named Titus Livius, who claimed the Ptolemies copied every scroll that came into Alexandria, storing the original and giving a duplicate back to its owner. This act, accumulation under the guise of preservation, is not neutral. It is domination masked as stewardship. To control knowledge is to shape reality. If the originals were never returned, if they were hidden or destroyed, what was erased was not just information, but possibility. How many civilizations have built on inherited lies? The library is said to have housed a complete copy of Berossus's Babyloniaca, a lost text containing the early histories of the world, including strange beings called Apkallu, who brought wisdom after a great flood. Echoes of these figures appear in Sumerian tablets and later in Hebrew apocrypha. They are part man, part fish, or perhaps that is only symbolic. And they teach languages, astronomy, law, measurement of time. What if these were not myths, but corrupted memories of real instructors from before? There are hints, not proof, never proof, but hints that drift through time like embers in wind. Consider the Edfu temple texts in Egypt, carved into stone, describing a primordial island civilization destroyed by fire and flood. Priests there spoke of the homeland of the gods, of sacred texts kept in a house of life, passed down before the earth shifted. These inscriptions, dating back centuries before the library, were reportedly consulted by scholars in Alexandria. Did copies of these oral traditions live on inside its walls? Did someone try to connect the fragments, and perhaps succeed? What if the loss of the library was not a singular loss, but a ritual severing? A way to ensure no bridge remained between the present and the origin. The timing, too, raises questions. The gradual vanishing of the library's contents overlaps with the rise of centralized dogmas, both religious and political. Empires expand by simplifying, faiths survive by editing. Between the 4th and 7th centuries, the world changed not just politically, but metaphysically. Ideas of a cyclical universe, reincarnation, divine feminine, cosmic balance, once widespread, began to vanish, replaced by linear time, final judgment, patriarchal order. It is not unreasonable to ask, did the destruction of the library serve a symbolic function, a cleansing of the old paradigm? And if so, who cleansed it? The Ptolemies who built it were Greek rulers of Egyptian land, caught between worship and conquest. Later, Rome absorbed it into its empire. After that, Byzantium. After that, the Islamic caliphates. Each new regime, a new filter, a new opportunity to rewrite, if even fragments survived. Where are they? Some whisper that scrolls were smuggled east to monasteries in the Himalayas, or south to hidden caches in Ethiopia. Others believe secret societies preserved parts of its knowledge, the Hermetic orders, the Gnostics, the alchemists, each carrying a thread, weaving it into their symbols and rituals. Could Rosicrucian texts, for example, trace a lineage back to Alexandria? Their lore speaks of ancient brotherhoods, invisible colleges, and knowledge lost in flames. But then again, perhaps that's only myth built atop a myth. Still, one returns to the unease. Not everything lost was an accident. Some things were meant to be forgotten. And yet, even forgetting is an act of intention. Who decides what humanity remembers? The sea laps quietly against what remains of ancient Alexandria, and somewhere beneath the modern city's streets lie the shadows of foundations that once held one of the most ambitious projects of the ancient world. But even stone forgets when pressed for too long under the weight of silence. And if memory can decay in a human mind, can it also rot in civilizations? There's something peculiar about how little physical evidence remains. A library of such scale, said to contain upwards of 400,000 scrolls, some sources claim even double that, should leave behind ashes, fragments, debris. And yet, what we find is absence. Not ruins, but vanishing. Not loss, but erasure. As if something, or someone, had made it a point not just to destroy, but to remove the idea that it ever truly existed in the first place. Perhaps this is why the few accounts we do have conflict so strangely. Strabo, the geographer, writes about visiting Alexandria around 20 BCE, but he says little of the library itself. Philo of Byblos speaks vaguely of sacred records in the temples. Later writers mention the daughter library in the Serapeum, a place where scrolls may have been relocated after earlier destruction. But which destruction? And which scrolls? These whispers sound like memories told through generations, each time a little more altered, a little less certain. One might begin to wonder if the library ever existed in the form we imagine. But that doubt, too, feels suspicious. Because doubt creates another form of forgetting. And forgetting makes it easier for truth to be rewritten. Historians, when they attempt to reconstruct the nature of the library, rely heavily on the accounts of later sources. Men like Plutarch, Galen, Ammianus Marcellinus, but they all speak from after the fact. None of them stood beneath its domes or held its scrolls in hand. And so, every testimony is a story about a story, not evidence. Every version of the library becomes less about what was and more about what was allowed to be remembered. This distortion reaches deep. It is not just the materials that vanished, but the world view they represented. Ancient libraries were not neutral storehouses. They were cosmological mirrors. What a civilization kept, what it preserved, translated, and studied, reflected what it believed about itself and the universe. So, what does it mean when all that is gone? There is one record, seldom discussed, from a traveler named Clemens of Alexandria, who mentioned that sacred Egyptian writings were kept not in temples alone, but also in secret vaults below the earth. These were places only initiated priests could enter. If the library ever accessed such texts, if those texts were transcribed, they may have been part of a deeper archive, one less visible, more protected, or perhaps more targeted. Consider the idea that the most powerful knowledge was never kept in plain sight, that even within the library there were layers, outer scrolls for the public, inner texts for the philosophers, and somewhere deeper still, writings encoded not just with language, but with symbols, rituals, frequencies. Echoes of this concept appear in Hermetic writings. As above, so below. The seen and unseen, the outer and the inner. A library of dual worlds. Could it be that the destruction of the library wasn't about eliminating what was known, but what could be unlocked? There are tantalizing suggestions from scholars like Athanasius Kircher, a 17th-century Jesuit who studied Egyptian symbols obsessively. He believed that beneath the hieroglyphs were layers of encoded metaphysical truths, mathematics of spirit, diagrams of cosmic architecture. He wrote of ancient languages that resonated, literally vibrated in ways that affected the mind differently. If the Library of Alexandria housed records in such forms, texts meant not just to inform, but to transform. Then its destruction was not merely political, it was metaphysical. We begin to sense the possibility that someone, somewhere, feared what that knowledge might awaken. After all, it is one thing to control people's beliefs. It is another to control their tools of perception. And in those centuries following the library's disappearance, we see a pattern emerge. Rigid orthodoxy replacing pluralism, centralized doctrines replacing mystery traditions. The multiplicity of cosmologies, Egyptian, Greek, Persian, Vedic, Chaldean, all began to fade or be restructured under monolithic systems. Many of these new systems warned against the old gods, the old texts, the old wisdoms, called them dangerous, called them demonic. Why? Who decides what is sacred and what must be forgotten? A curious thread runs through all of this, the link between sound and memory. Ancient cultures believed that words spoken with intention shaped reality. The Egyptian heka, the spoken charm. The Hebrew dabar, a word that acts, the logos of the Greeks. If scrolls in the library contained phonetic codes, chants, mantras, vibrational technologies, they would be powerful not because of what they said, but what they did. Such scrolls, read aloud, might alter the consciousness of the reader. Could that be why they had to disappear? Today, researchers of cymatics study how sound creates patterns in matter, sand dancing into mandalas on a metal plate when exposed to frequency, water forming sacred geometry under vibration. What if ancient texts recorded the knowledge of how to use sound not just for worship, but for healing, for transformation, for construction? There are legends of temples built not with slaves and levers, but with tone, intoned resonance-lifting stones. Are these merely metaphors? Or are they echoes? The library may have held clues, blueprints, not in diagrams but in linguistic waveforms. And if someone found them, if someone realized what they implied, would they preserve them or bury them? What we think of as progress often walks hand in hand with amnesia. For new ideas to rise, older ones must sometimes be removed, not because they are false, but because they are inconvenient. And so, through war, conquest, fire, and rewriting, the most dangerous ideas are not disproven. They are simply unremembered. The Library of Alexandria burned, yes, but that may not have been the end. It may have only been the visible part of a far larger forgetting. Beneath the layers of history lie deeper layers still, whispered, hidden, protected not by vaults, but by disbelief, and somewhere among those buried fragments. A question waits. If we knew what was truly lost, would we still call it progress? There is a peculiar tension that arises when we look too closely at the foundations of what we call civilization. A feeling that beneath the order, the roads, the books, the timelines, something doesn't align. That history, as we inherit it, carries the faint scent of curation. Or worse, cleansing. The Library of Alexandria was not the first repository of knowledge. But perhaps it was the last that dared to hold everything, the sacred, the scientific, the speculative, the profane. A cathedral of pluralism, it welcomed the Vedas and Babylonian star charts, Orphic hymns and Egyptian cosmograms, Homeric epics, and unknown tongues. It was, if we believe the accounts, a sanctuary for competing truths, and perhaps that was its crime. Empires do not thrive on complexity. They require consensus, enforced through ritual, language, narrative. The library was a threat not because it defied authority, but because it dissolved singularity. A single idea can be defended. 1,000 ideas must be destroyed. What remains most unsettling is how early the threads began to unravel. Even as it flourished under the Ptolemies, there were already those who questioned its openness. Why should foreign knowledge be preserved? Why should priests allow their sacred writings to be translated? The act of translation is not neutral, it is interpretation. And interpretation is a kind of possession. There are rumors that certain scrolls, especially those dealing with rituals, star calendars, and language before Babel, were deliberately mistranslated, or withheld from translation entirely. Could this be why so little survives? Not just because it was burned, but because the act of copying was already filtered by intention? Some scholars suggest that the earliest curators of the library, like Demetrius of Phalerum, were not simply collectors but gatekeepers, that decisions were made even then about what deserved inclusion and what did not. We think of libraries as passive, but they are not. They are shaped by what they exclude. There is a strange tale preserved in Fragments of a scroll brought from India, written in a script said to predate Brahmi, filled with geometric diagrams and mantric equations. It was placed not in the main collection, but in a sealed chamber accessible only to initiates. Why? What power lay in those patterns? Later accounts describe scrolls that could not be translated, not because of missing grammar, but because they resisted meaning. Symbols that defied mapping, invoked images or dreams instead of thoughts. Was this nonsense? Or were these texts crafted for another kind of mind? Consider this. If some scrolls were encoded not for reading, but for meditating, experienced through sound or image rather than syntax, how would we even begin to understand them now? Modern neuroscience tells us that certain symbols, especially archetypes, trigger responses deep in the limbic system, before cognition even arrives. Is it possible ancient civilizations knew this? That they embedded wisdom not just in logic but in sensation? What then was the library truly collecting? Some suggest it was more than information, that it was a mirror of consciousness, a tool to shape the self, not merely inform it. And such a tool, in the wrong hands, would be dangerous. Here the story shifts, not into fact, but into shadow. There are whispers in Masonic lore, fragments in Gnostic codices, hints in the writings of Arab polymaths, all suggesting that a portion of the library was removed before its fall. Not saved, but hidden. Taken not by invaders, but by those within. A controlled disappearance. One legend speaks of a secret archive buried beneath the sands near Siwa Oasis, guarded by an order that predates even the pharaohs. Another claims the scrolls were smuggled to Pergamon, the rival library, and from there selectively disseminated to those who could bear the burden of truth. Burden. That word echoes strangely. Why would truth be a burden, unless it revealed something we could not unsee? There is another possibility, one far more disquieting. What if the library was not simply a sanctuary for ancient knowledge, but for memory itself? A place where timelines blurred, where forbidden histories, alternate chronologies, counter-narratives were preserved. What if, among the scrolls, were records of civilizations erased, not by time, but by choice? There are recurring themes in comparative mythology. A great flood, a lost golden age, sky beings who taught early humans the arts of measurement, farming, healing. We are taught to dismiss these as allegory. But what if they are censored history? Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Decend, in their book Hamlet's Mill, argue that myth encodes astronomy, and that many ancient stories are maps of the stars, not fantasies. They trace an ancient science hidden in symbols. If true, then myths may contain data. And if that data disrupts our modern timeline, it becomes dangerous. Did the library preserve such myths, not as fiction, but as veiled testimony? And did someone decide the veil should never be lifted? Imagine this: a civilization that did not believe history moved forward, but in cycles. That time spirals, repeats, that we are not progressing, but looping. Such a worldview undermines the modern myth of progress. It dissolves the arrow, and once the arrow bends, control becomes harder to maintain. Control thrives on amnesia. So perhaps the library was not only destroyed to erase what was, but to prevent the return of what might be. In his Corpus Hermeticum, the figure of Hermes Trismegistus, who some associate with Thoth, others with Enoch, speaks of the time when men will turn away from wisdom and prefer lies. He warns of an age when temples will be empty, the stars ignored, the soul denied. A strange premonition, one that resonates today. Could it be that the library preserved such warnings? That someone read them and believed them, or feared them? There are moments, fleeting and peripheral, when you feel the shape of what might have been. A déjà vu not of memory, but of potential. A world where the library still stood, and humanity took a different path, one rooted not in dominance, but in depth. That world did not die, it was silenced. But even silence leaves a frequency, a pulse, a presence, and sometimes, in the quietest hours, you can still hear it calling. What if forgetting is not the end, but the invitation to remember? There is an unease that grows the deeper one gazes into the library's shadow. Not fear, exactly, but a sense of trespassing, as if some part of the past has curled inward, resisting discovery, as if history itself had decided to protect certain secrets from being fully known. It is in that resistance we begin to see a pattern, not in what has survived, but in what has not. Consider the fields most disrupted by the library's destruction: astronomy, medicine, sacred geometry, comparative theology. Each of these disciplines, in the centuries that followed, fragmented into pieces. In place of synthesis came specialization. In place of intuitive cosmology, mechanistic logic. The body no longer reflected the stars. The soul no longer shaped the diagnosis. We became split, above from below, mind from matter, spirit from structure. What if the library once held the unifying thread? Some accounts claim that among the scrolls were complete texts from the ancient Chaldeans, star priests of Babylon, whose astronomical observations stretched back thousands of years. These weren't mere charts of stars, but records of their movement through what we might now call ages, not in centuries, but in precessional cycles of 26,000 years. To them, time was not a line, but a wheel. Human events were not isolated, but reflected in the heavens. Alignments foretold shifts in consciousness, not just weather. And if such knowledge truly existed, knowledge that tied empires to eclipses, consciousness to constellations, would it not be valuable to those who rule? Or dangerous? After all, the ability to predict is also the ability to prepare, or to prevent. There are whispers, often dismissed as pseudo-history, that the library contained writings from civilizations that predated even Egypt and Sumer. Not mythic tales, but records, names, places, maps, formulas. The idea that writing began in 3000 BCE begins to dissolve under such suggestions. What if writing is not an invention, but a rediscovery? And if that is true, how many times have we forgotten? The destruction of the library becomes more than a tragedy. It becomes a turning point, a wound in the continuity of memory. Even the name Alexandria carries a kind of irony. Founded by Alexander the Great, who was trained by Aristotle, who himself was a student of Plato, and yet most of Plato's esoteric works are lost. What survives are dialogues, accessible enough for public consumption. But the teachings on cosmogenesis, the nature of the soul's descent into matter, the mystery of the one beyond form, those were reportedly passed down orally or kept in the inner schools. And the library? It was said to contain full commentaries on these teachings, perhaps even the complete texts of the Pythagorean Brotherhood, documents that explored sound, number, vibration, and their role in shaping reality. We often associate Pythagoras with triangles and equations, but in ancient accounts, he was less a mathematician than a mystic. He believed the universe was built on harmony, that every celestial body sang a tone, inaudible to us only because we are bathed in it constantly. He called it the music of the spheres. Did the library preserve that song? Some now believe it did, or fragments of it. The theory of musica universalis has re-emerged in theoretical physics, where string theory suggests that at the smallest scales, particles are not points, but vibrating strings. And vibration, after all, is sound, inaudible, perhaps, but present. Echoes of ancient insight within the language of modern science. What if the ancients were not guessing? What if they remembered? To erase such memory would not merely be political, it would be existential. A civilization built upon fragmented truth must ensure the whole remains buried. Otherwise, the architecture of the present begins to crack. There is a curious phenomenon in the archaeological record, sudden knowledge appearing without explanation. The Sumerians, with no clear precursor, develop advanced astronomy and cuneiform. The Egyptians, seemingly from nowhere, build pyramids aligned with celestial precision. The Indus Valley, forgotten for centuries, reveals urban planning more complex than cities built a millennium later. These are not isolated anomalies. They are clues, and perhaps they once connected. Perhaps the library was the node that held them all, the crossroad where timelines converged, and from which we might have charted a map not of empire, but of evolution. One account, sparse, often ignored, speaks of a scholar named Callimachus, an early librarian of Alexandria. He attempted to catalog every scroll in the collection. His index, the Pinakes, was said to span 120 volumes. Of that monumental work, only fragments remain. No one speaks of what was on those missing pages. But if each volume listed thousands of scrolls, what was there? What names have been deleted from memory? Not just the texts, but the authors themselves? To silence a writer is one thing. To silence the knowledge that a writer ever existed, that is another. And then there are the temples. Not far from the site of the ancient library once stood the Serapeum, a grand complex dedicated to Serapis, a deity created to bridge Greek and Egyptian religious thought. Some say it housed the daughter library. Others argue it was a place of initiation, not scholarship. But the distinction may be false. If knowledge is transformation, then every library is a temple. And if the Serapeum was destroyed, as later Christian sources report, with its statues smashed and its scrolls burned, then the destruction was not just intellectual, it was ritual, a killing of the old gods, a purification of thought. But who decides what is impure? That question lingers. The deeper we look into Alexandria, the more we sense a narrowing of vision, from many truths to one, from inquiry to obedience. The flames that consumed the scrolls may have been literal or metaphorical. What matters is the loss was thorough. The silence was engineered. And yet, silence is never complete. Somewhere, beneath words, beneath time, beneath the soot of conquest, something remains, waiting not to be proven, but to be remembered. There's something unsettling about the way certain names vanish, not with ceremony, not with denial, just absence. No mention in the archives, no inscriptions on stone, no surviving line of a scroll. As if entire lineages of thinkers, mystics, healers, and star readers once walked the halls of the library, and then, all at once, were no longer part of the world we're allowed to remember. And what of those who were remembered, but distorted? Take Hypatia, for example, the last known head of the library, or perhaps only its last symbolic custodian, a philosopher, mathematician, astronomer, a woman who dared to teach in public, who drew students from across the Roman world. Her death was not just a killing, it was a dismemberment. Torn apart by a mob, her skin flayed with oyster shells, a violence so specific it feels ritualistic. As though her body became a message, she was accused of witchcraft, of manipulating political minds through arcane knowledge. But what knowledge, exactly? What did she carry, or preserve, that so terrified the rising tide of dogma? And more haunting still, what did she know she couldn't write down? There are suggestions, faint and scattered, that Hypatia had access to scrolls from the older parts of the library, those housed in subterranean vaults, away from the public wings, not merely philosophical texts, but diagrams of planetary harmonics, treatises on the soul's geometry, transcriptions of rituals once practiced by priests of Thoth and Isis, remnants from a time when science and spirit were not rivals, but reflections. None of those scrolls survived. But the violence of her death did. Almost as if the flames had shifted form, from fire in the harbor to fire in the streets. And still, we ask, why? Why such rage at a library, at knowledge? Unless that knowledge threatened more than ideas, unless it threatened the story. Because a civilization is not built only with stone. It is built with narrative, with the illusion of certainty, with the power to say, this is what happened, and silence all else. And so the deeper one peers into the story of Alexandria, the more one feels the pull, not toward answers, but toward a void meticulously maintained. There are travelers' accounts, centuries later, describing the region around Alexandria as strangely magnetic, not just in compass readings, but in mood, a kind of heaviness, a dissonance, as if something unseen still lingered beneath the surface. Stones carved in ways that no longer match surviving tools. Tunnels sealed with forgotten symbols. Vaults whose keys vanished along with the names of their keepers. Could the library have left an imprint, energetic, psychological, even geological? In the Himalayas, Tibetan monks speak of termic knowledge, truths that hide themselves when danger is near and reveal themselves only to those prepared. In Egypt, The priests once believed certain knowledge could not be destroyed, only concealed in such a way that only the soul, properly initiated, could remember. Was the library a kind of memory palace for humanity? And if so, what happens when the palace falls? Do we too forget what we were? There are researchers, on the fringe of academia, yet deeply rigorous, who propose that the destruction of ancient centers of learning, from Nineveh to Nalanda to Alexandria, follows not random chaos, but a cycle, a pattern where civilizations are periodically reset. Knowledge peaks, then burns, a kind of amnesia built into the species, or perhaps imposed upon it. Is this why ancient myths speak of golden ages, followed by dark ones? Is this why cultures separated by oceans, from the Hopi to the Hindus, describe epochs ending in fire and water? If the library contained records from those past ages, it would be the greatest threat to the illusion of linear time, a challenge to the myth that we are modern, advanced, singular. What if we are none of those things? What if we are interrupted? In the early 20th century, a cache of ancient papyri was discovered near Oxyrhynchus, not far from Alexandria. Among them were fragments of lost plays, gospels never canonized, and texts that reference schools of philosophy long thought to be fictional. One papyrus, torn and faint, makes mention of the Well of Mirrors, a chamber where the stars whispered in silence. Scholars dismissed it as poetic metaphor. But is metaphor always metaphor? Could it not be memory struggling to survive through allegory? There's a theory, quietly debated in esoteric circles, that the library was more than scrolls on shelves, that it included chambers of resonance, rooms designed with acoustic precision, where sound could be shaped like clay. Visitors would enter not to read, but to listen, to vibrate, to remember. Such ideas sound fanciful until one considers the Temple of Hathor at Dendera. There, on the ceiling, are carvings of what appear to be tuning devices, musical instruments aligned to the stars. The temple's crypts, when tested, exhibit unusual acoustic properties, frequencies that seem to affect brain waves, heart rate, not by suggestion, but by structure. What if similar principles were used in Alexandria? What if the library was also a machine? Not in the sense of gears and wires, but in the deeper sense, a structure built to interface with human consciousness, to remind us. And if so, then burning it would be more than symbolic. It would be sabotage. Perhaps this is why, even now, the library is never fully discussed in schools. It is mentioned, then moved past, treated as tragedy, not crime, as accident, not omen. But the silence is too curated, and in that curated silence, an echo remains, of scrolls written by forgotten hands, of stars charted by minds no longer named, of truths too large for the world that replaced them. What if we are not the inheritors of ancient knowledge, but the survivors of its burial? Sometimes the most revealing thing is not what has been lost, but what has survived. A single line in a medieval manuscript, a marginal note in a monk's copybook, a passing phrase in a traveler's account, things that shouldn't matter yet linger, out of context, out of time, like echoes that refuse to fade. In a 9th century Arabic text attributed to Al-Kindi, there is mention of the lost mirrors of Alexandria. Not metaphorical mirrors, but devices, polished metal discs said to hold strange inscriptions and to reflect more than light. The text claims they were used by the priests of the ancient city to speak with the stars. The claim is vague, obscure, immediately followed by an abrupt shift in topic, as though even writing the sentence demanded retreat. But why mention them at all? Why preserve a rumor? Unless, in some strange way, it demanded to be remembered. The idea of instruments, not for observing but for communion, recurs in unexpected places. In late Gnostic writings, there are descriptions of aeonic lenses, objects crafted to focus the mind toward the pleroma, the divine fullness beyond the material world. In early Christian Apocrypha, references to the glass of Sophia, which reveals both heaven and the shadow beneath it. These are not treated as metaphor. They are named like tools, used and misplaced. Could such artifacts have been stored in Alexandria? Could the library have been more than text? If so, then its destruction was not merely the loss of information, but of instruments, of capacities. We often imagine ancient knowledge as primitive, merely because it came before. But what if it was different, not lesser, but other? A logic rooted in symbol, a science that spoke in form, not formula. Something not repeatable in laboratories, but felt, intuited, embodied. Something modern systems were not built to detect, and therefore dismissed. It is worth asking, what kind of knowledge would fear no burning? Not the kind that lives only on paper, but the kind that rewires the mind itself. There are rumors that the library contained not only scrolls, but memory theaters, spaces designed to embed knowledge directly into perception. The ancient art of memory, practiced by orators and mystics alike, was not just mental discipline. It was architecture. People built palaces as a mind, peopled with images, colors, sensations. In Alexandria, some say these structures were not just imagined. They were mirrored in stone, rooms designed to reflect inner terrain, a fusion of psychology and sacred geometry. No traces of such chambers survive. But absence does not prove they never existed. Perhaps the more potent the room, the faster it was buried. There is an account by a 6th century Alexandrian physician named Stephanus, long overlooked, who wrote of a silent room beneath the Serapeum, where the voice of the gods was felt, not heard. He claimed the room was used to restore the balance of the humors through harmonics. Again, the language is archaic, blurred by cosmology. But what if, stripped of metaphor, he described acoustic therapy? Sonic medicine? And if so, who built such a space? And what else did they build? All across Egypt, and across other ancient sites in South America and Asia, we find megalithic structures with precise resonance qualities. The king's chamber in the Great Pyramid resonates at 432 Hz. The hypogeum of Hal Saflieni in Malta, carved into rock 5,000 years ago, amplifies certain vocal frequencies with physiological effects. These sites were not merely tombs or temples, they were tuned. Why assume Alexandria was any different? What if the library was designed to vibrate with the body, not just the mind? What if learning was once a sensory ritual? This raises another question, one that lingers uncomfortably. If such structures existed and were destroyed, were they targeted for their information, or for the experiences they enabled? The difference is subtle, but immense. A scroll can be copied. A sensation, especially one that alters awareness, cannot. It must be lived. And if a civilization knew how to generate altered states not through substance, but structure, then its buildings were libraries, its architecture, a pedagogy. And to destroy it, was to delete a language we no longer know how to read. Consider this. Ancient Egyptian temples were constructed with stone types known today to conduct subtle electromagnetic fields. Quartz, granite, diorite, all materials that respond to pressure and vibration. Were the ancients aware of this? Or was their selection aesthetic, intuitive, or both? Modern engineers marvel at how those structures have endured earthquakes and centuries of wear. But few ask, what did they sound like when whole? If Alexandria's buildings were built with similar intention, designed not just to house knowledge, but to activate it, then their destruction was more than cultural. It was neurological. A rupture in the way human beings once encountered truth. And what happens over centuries when a species forgets how to learn? With the whole self? Perhaps we become obsessed with fragments, obsessed with proof, with evidence, with citation. And perhaps in doing so, we lose access to the kind of knowing that cannot be printed. Only lived, only remembered when re-encountered in stillness or symbol or sound. Like the shape of a dream you cannot explain, but feel in your bones. So maybe the library's destruction was not the end of knowledge. Maybe it was the beginning of its exile, cast out of books, cast out of stone, and into the spaces between, the places we don't dare look, in silence, in memory, in the part of you that listens, not with ears, but with something older, something we've been taught to forget, something that even now waits beneath the ash. There are cities that live above ground, and cities that live below. Alexandria may have been both. We picture the sunlit halls, the towering shelves, the quiet shuffle of papyrus scrolls. But beneath that world, there are rumors of another, older, deeper, vaults carved not by architects, but by initiates, tunnels that predated the Greek founding of the city, caverns that whispered, not with wind, but with memory. Most dismiss these tales. They point to a lack of excavation, the modern city built atop layers of antiquity, inaccessible, inconvenient. But that absence, again, feels too convenient. Every time someone edges close to the truth of what may lie below, the trail ends. Political instability, funding pulled, a natural collapse. Always something, always silence. But there is one account, fragile and mostly forgotten, written by a traveler named Menodoros of Rhodes. He visited Alexandria in the 1st century BCE, not as a scholar, but as a merchant. In a letter found centuries later in the archives of a Cypriot monastery, he describes being led, briefly, and without permission, into an underground hall by a friend within the priesthood. He writes of columns carved with faces not entirely human, of walls that shimmered faintly in the torchlight, as if embedded with metal, and of a dome that, when he spoke, reflected his words back to him in voices that were not his own. He left the next morning and never returned. The letter ends with a phrase that doesn't quite translate, but which scholars approximate as, "Some places remember, even when we forget." The line lingers. Places that remember. Could Alexandria have been such a place? And if so, what did it remember that we do not? There is an idea, radical yet ancient, that certain locations hold consciousness, not metaphorically, but literally, that a place once charged with enough intention, emotion, or wisdom begins to store echoes. These echoes are not ghosts. They are patterns, energies that linger, residues of thought. If the library was built atop such a site, a geomagnetic nexus, a sacred coordinate, then its destruction may have been an erasure not just of books, but of access. to something deeper, something that modern maps do not chart. This is not without precedent. In Delphi, the oracle spoke from a chamber above a fault line, where gases, later identified as ethylene, rose from the earth. At Chichen Itza, the main pyramid was built over a cenote, a sacred well. At Göbekli Tepe, the world's oldest known temple, stone circles align not just to stars, but to underground aquifers, water singing beneath the rock. What if the Library of Alexandria, too, sat atop a place where the world thinned, a place where mind met matter, a place where knowing wasn't passive, but participatory? And what happens when a civilization loses such a place? Perhaps it compensates. With theories, with technologies, with stories. But none of them truly replace what was once felt directly. In the wake of the library's disappearance, we see a strange thing. A flurry of activity in secret schools, the rise of Neoplatonism, the surge of Hermetic writings, alchemical manuscripts beginning to circulate, coded and concealed, as if the guardians of knowledge knew what was coming and scattered the pieces before the hammer fell. Some suggest these teachings did not originate post-Alexandria, but were fragments salvaged from it. Not inventions, but survivals, preserved in fragments, encrypted in metaphor, passed hand to hand through centuries of darkness. In the Corpus Hermeticum, Hermes Trismegistus writes, "Egypt is an image of heaven, and the whole cosmos dwells here, in this its sanctuary." He speaks of the stars as books, and man as a mirror of the divine. These were not idle mysticisms. They were blueprints, maps of consciousness, operating manuals for the self. If such texts existed in the library, they would have been dangerous, not because they were false, but because they refused submission. They did not rely on intermediaries, institutions, hierarchies. They taught that truth was direct, intimate, internal, that a human being was not a subject, but a cosmos. What power structure could tolerate that? And so, over time, the message was inverted. Mysticism became heresy, knowledge became sin, the stars became distant, and the body, once a temple, became a prison. But fragments remain. Always fragments. In the Nag Hammadi texts, discovered in 1945, we find echoes of what might have once lined Alexandria's shelves. Gospels that speak of inner light, of divine memory, of worlds layered within worlds. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is quoted as saying, "The kingdom is within you, and it is outside you," a line that blurs all boundaries, that renders churches unnecessary, that collapses walls. Lines like that do not survive by accident. They slip through cracks, just like the memory of the library. Sometimes we mistake mystery for absence, but mystery is not absence. It is a presence veiled. And maybe that is what Alexandria has become. Not a loss, but a veil. A question we are not meant to answer, but to carry. Like a wound that whispers, or a mirror we no longer dare to face. Because if the library truly held all things, the sacred and the profane, the maps and the mirrors, the songs and the sciences, then to remember it fully would be to confront not just what was taken, but what we were, and what we might be again, if we dared to remember. What if memory itself is the oldest battlefield, not territory, not ideology, but memory? What is remembered? What is permitted to endure? What is allowed to be called truth? And what if the Library of Alexandria was the last great stronghold of memory before the gates were sealed? We tend to think of history as a straight line, a progression from dark to light. But the deeper one listens, the more that narrative phrase. What if we haven't been moving forward, but circling around something we once knew and have forgotten? What if the library wasn't merely a house of records, but a compass? One pointing back to a place we no longer recognize, not because it's distant, but because it's buried beneath the rubble of stories we were told to believe. There's a strange phenomenon in the annals of ancient knowledge: the recurrence of certain numbers, certain ratios, certain geometric forms. The number 72, the precessional constant, the golden ratio, the flower of life. These symbols are found in Egypt, in India, in Mesoamerica, in ancient China. Cultures allegedly unconnected, yet drawing from the same numerical language. Coincidence is the salve we apply when patterns become uncomfortable. But what if these cultures were not separate? What if they were fragments, branches of a forgotten root system? And what if the library once held the blueprint, a cartography of consciousness, a record of origins not just biological, but metaphysical? That human beings are not just shaped by evolution, but by memory. That our symbols are not inventions, but recollections. Such ideas are dangerous, not because they are false, but because they are uncontainable. Once you begin to believe that the mind carries memory beyond the span of a single life, institutions begin to tremble. Once you suggest that knowledge may have emerged, not from ignorance, but from a forgetting, history begins to blur, and the present loses its claim to certainty. That is why fire matters, not just as destruction, but as metaphor. Fire is purifying. Fire is final. When scrolls burn, so do the lineages they carry. When voices go silent, so do the questions they dared to ask. And in the case of Alexandria, what burned was more than pages. It was possibility. Imagine a child, in some forgotten century, walking through the library's halls. Imagine her fingers grazing a scroll, a treatise on dream incubation from Anatolia, or a record of astral navigation techniques used by Phoenician priests. She may not understand the language. She may not grasp the meaning. But something registers. A symbol, a phrase, a diagram that awakens an ancient familiarity. Learning, in such a place, was not about data. It was about recognition. And recognition is a kind of remembering. Perhaps this is why so many traditions speak of knowledge as something already within us. The Upanishads, the Gnostics, the Hermeticists, all teaching that the soul carries what it needs, and that true wisdom is not acquired, but unveiled. The library may have been a veil-lifting place, a sanctuary for remembering. So what happens when such a place is destroyed? We inherit confusion. Not just of facts, but of self. Even now we search for knowledge in fragments, disconnected data, buried artifacts, a footnote here, a rumor there. Our archives are thick with contradiction. Our timelines stretch thinner the further back we look. And at the core, a silence named Alexandria. It is not just the loss of texts that haunts. It is the way the loss was absorbed, how quickly the world moved on, as though a wound had been covered but never stitched, as though the forgetting had been rehearsed. We speak of the Renaissance as a rebirth of learning. But what if it was only a faint echo of what was once possible? What if the printing press democratized the word, but arrived too late to save the deeper libraries? What if all our enlightenment was lit with the sparks that fell after the fire? There are stories of scrolls that escaped, of caravans heading east, of secret vaults in Tibet, of coded texts in Moorish Spain, of guarded knowledge that surfaced in the hands of men like Giordano Bruno, who spoke of an infinite cosmos, of beings on other stars, of the divine in every particle, before he, too, was burned. And again, fire. Why is it that those who remember too much are always drawn to flame? It's as if the world cannot tolerate certain vibrations, as if memory, ungoverned, is too volatile. But the embers remain. They flicker in forgotten corners, in untranslatable diagrams etched on stone, in chants whose meanings have shifted, but whose tones still open doors, in questions whispered by those who do not feel at home in the story they've been told. Alexandria may be gone, but its pattern remains. It's in the desire to know more than we are allowed. It's in the urge to connect disciplines that modernity has separated. It's in the quiet knowing that there are truths too large to fit in the margins of official history. Maybe that's why you're still listening. Not because you expect an answer, but because some part of you remembers that there used to be one. And maybe, just maybe, that answer isn't something we will ever read. Maybe it's something we are becoming again. As the ash settles, as the echoes grow louder, as we remember what the fire was trying to erase, there is a kind of memory that lives beneath words, not in books or inscriptions, not even in whispered traditions passed through generations, but deeper, embodied, cellular, the kind of knowing that doesn't arrive, but stirs. Like a dream returning without name, or a song whose melody survives though its lyrics are lost. And sometimes, when we speak of places like the Library of Alexandria, we are not only mourning burned scrolls or vanished halls. We are mourning the severing of that deeper memory, the theft of something we didn't even know we once carried. Because not all knowledge was written. Some was woven into rituals, into seasonal patterns, into how a temple faced the sun, how incense curled in a chamber, how a story was told not to teach facts, but to rearrange the soul. And if the library held such threads, if it collected more than ideas, if it held the songlines of civilizations, then its loss was not just intellectual, it was initiatory, a forced forgetting, the breaking of a chain not of logic, but of presence. Even today, some ruins seem to remember. There are travelers who speak of standing amid the columns of Karnak or the stones of Saqqara and feeling something stir. A disorientation not caused by scale or heat or fatigue, but by recognition, as if the body knows something the mind cannot place, as if the air itself hums with memory. Could it be that the library was once the key to such places? That the scrolls, now gone, once contained the tuning forks for temples long dormant? There are clues in fragments of Hermetic writings, in encoded diagrams from the school of Chartres, in the geometry of cathedrals that mimic older, stranger proportions, numbers that speak not only of beauty, but of resonance. Some have speculated that the destruction of Alexandria was not merely an act of war or accident, but part of a deeper project, the dismantling of the ancient science of relationship. The understanding that every part of the cosmos reflects the whole, that the position of the stars speaks to the tides of the heart, that the shape of a room affects the clarity of thought, that the telling of a myth can rebalance the body. This was the knowledge the library is said to have preserved, not compartmentalized, not divided into disciplines, but whole, alive, and in such a world view, everything is sacred. To lose that is to fall into fragmentation. We see the effects even now. Science divorced from spirit, medicine stripped of ritual, education reduced to memorization, no longer a rite of passage but a transaction. Knowledge flattened, reduced, drained of its transformative core. But what if that transformation was once the very point? What if the library was less a vault and more a vessel? A place not simply to store data, but to awaken capacity. There are whispers from Sufi mystics, from the Kabbalists, from the remnants of Vedic scholars, that true knowledge cannot be transferred without change. That to learn something truly is to become something new. And that sacred texts, in their original form, were built for that purpose, not to be read, to be entered. Could the scrolls of Alexandria have functioned like initiations? Symbols that unfold only after contemplation. Codes that activate only in ritual. Maps that lead not to distant lands, but inward, toward buried memory. There's a concept in ancient languages that the original word was not descriptive, but creative, that to speak was to shape. The Egyptian Medu Necher, the words of the gods, were believed to be vibrational forces. Hieroglyphs were not alphabet, they were action. The library may have housed the last coherent repository of such language, and its loss may have set us adrift in a world where language now describes, but no longer reveals, where words explain, but no longer invoke. What then are we searching for in its absence? Perhaps not facts. Perhaps we are seeking the lost voice, the tone that once wove the visible with the invisible. Even the name Alexandria begins to sound less like a city and more like a cipher, a node in a network that stretched across continents, from the mystery schools of Greece to the fire altars of Persia, the pyramids of Mexico, the stargazers of Angkor. A library not confined to walls, but written into the very earth, and Alexandria was its key, its index. And when the index burns, we no longer know where to look. We wander, we specialize, we forget. Not all at once, but gradually, thoroughly. And when forgetting becomes complete, it starts to look like normal. It becomes the story. And we stop asking why so many ruins align with stars, why so many myths echo the same flood, the same fire, the same beings descending from sky or sea. We stop noticing the patterns, or if we do, we dismiss them. Because to see the pattern clearly is to realize we've been severed. And that is almost too much to bear. So instead, we speak of history as progress. We build digital libraries, believing we have outgrown the old ones. But bytes do not hum. Screens do not resonate. And no algorithm has yet taught us how to remember what the soul already knows. Perhaps that is what Alexandria represents. Not a building, not even a collection, but a memory of how it felt to be whole, of what it meant to live in a world where knowledge was not hoarded, but honored, where learning was a return, not a reaching, where every answer led not to conclusion, but to deeper wonder. And perhaps that is why the library had to fall, because wonder is not easy to govern. The deeper we go, the less we are certain of anything. And perhaps that, too, is a kind of knowledge. For centuries, historians have argued over what was really inside the Library of Alexandria. The numbers fluctuate wildly. Some claim 40,000 scrolls, others 500,000. The more skeptical voices reduce it to a glorified archive, provincial, overhyped, nowhere near the grandeur so often romanticized. But it's not the quantity that haunts us. It never was. It's the quality of what was lost. The type of questions that may have once lived there. The kinds of answers we can no longer ask for. In a fragment attributed to the philosopher Damaskios, there is a passing mention of a book of luminous origins stored beneath the Serapeum. The phrase is never explained. Scholars assume it refers to a theological text, perhaps Platonic in nature. But the choice of words, luminous, not divine, suggests something stranger. Not light as metaphor, light as principle, a physics, not a faith. What if some scrolls weren't about stories, but frequencies? What if some of them carried knowledge we now place inside particle accelerators and supercomputers, but delivered in symbolic form? In metaphors calibrated for ancient minds, yet containing the same core truth? We assume knowledge moves forward. But what if it only moves differently? The Dogon people of Mali, long before modern astronomy, described Sirius B, a star invisible to the naked eye, as a dense, heavy companion star to Sirius A. They even knew its orbital period. Anthropologists were baffled. Where did that information come from? The Dogon claimed it came from the Nomo, beings who descended from the sky, bringing language and structure. Some called them gods, others teachers, but always they came with knowledge. What if stories like this weren't anomalies? What if they were echoes? And what if Alexandria was where those echoes once converged? We tend to treat myth as the opposite of fact. But in the ancient world, myth was a vessel, not for fiction, but for truths too complex to reduce into literal language. To say the gods came from the stars may not be astronomy, but it may not be nonsense either. The library may have been filled with such vessels, and the fire may not have destroyed all of them, but it severed the context. It broke the lineage. Without the initiatory frameworks, without the teachers to unpack the codes, the stories became superstition. And superstition was easy to discard. That is how memory dies, not in flame, but in translation. There is a strange gap in our historical understanding, a silence in how texts were meant to be used. We assume reading is passive, solitary, silent. But ancient reading was oral, rhythmic, chanted, shared. It was not consumption, it was communion. If scrolls in Alexandria were designed for this, for activation through voice, breath, repetition, then we lost more than meaning. We lost method, and method is everything. In medieval Europe, grimoires and prayer books began to echo remnants of this ancient style. Structured chants, geometric sigils, word combinations meant to do something, not merely say something. A degraded memory of a more complete system, one that had to be hidden, encrypted, disguised in the margins of Christian piety. Perhaps that is what survives when the center is burned, the periphery, the edge where memory mutates but never disappears entirely. It would explain the persistence of certain symbols. The serpent coiled, the winged disc, the eye inside the triangle. We see them everywhere, in temples, in alchemical manuscripts, on dollar bills. Their meanings have been debated, overwritten, appropriated. But they persist, as if they are too deeply embedded to erase. Were these symbols once part of a larger language, a grammar of consciousness? And if the library preserved that grammar, who would want it gone? It's easy to blame war, accident, conquest, to say that time erases. But time alone is not so precise. Time doesn't target scrolls with names like On the Music of the Spheres, or The Breath of Metals, or The Spiral Path to the One. Those titles, rumored, half-referenced in lost catalogs, were not preserved by accident. They were remembered by those who knew exactly what they meant and what they threatened. A single scroll, properly understood, could reframe an entire cosmology. And cosmologies build civilizations. It's no coincidence that the fall of the library overlaps with the rise of empires based on singular truth. Singular God, singular history, plurality became heresy, mystery became crime. Complexity was no longer beautiful. It was dangerous. So we adapted. We learned to call the unknown irrational. We learned to doubt the voice that stirred when standing beside ancient stones or hearing a chant that vibrated something unnameable inside the chest. We learned to forget that we once knew how to remember. And now, so much of what we search for is really that, a remembering. We dig ruins not just for artifacts, but for resonance, for a piece of ourselves buried in a layer older than any map will name. Sometimes we wonder why Alexandria captivates us still. Why a burned building, if it even burned at all, still smolders in the mind. It's not nostalgia, it's not fantasy, it's recognition. We feel, without proof, that something once lived there that could have changed everything, and that feeling is a form of knowing. Even if the scrolls are gone, the pattern remains. In dreams we don't understand, in questions we're afraid to ask, in symbols we can't stop seeing. The library is not behind us, it is beneath us, waiting not to be rebuilt, but to be re-entered. The more we look for Alexandria, the more it refuses to stay still. It slips through certainty, shifts under questions, never quite where we expect it to be. It lives not in ruins, but in patterns, like a constellation glimpsed only when you stop trying to map it. The harder you chase its facts, the more it dissolves. But sit still, and it begins to whisper. That whisper has never really gone away. Across cultures and centuries, we find stories of places like Alexandria. Not just libraries, but sanctuaries. Places where knowledge was more than information, where it was breath and ritual and fire, places where the world was not studied from the outside, but entered like a labyrinth. The Mayans spoke of a temple where the stars descended to sing. The Indians of a forest library, Naimisharanya, where sages downloaded entire worlds in meditation. The Sufis of the House of Wisdom, where geometry danced with poetry. These were not Alexandria in name, but in function. Memory nodes, mirrors of a shared longing. Longing for what? Maybe that's the question. What exactly was lost? The scrolls, the maps, the names of stars not yet rediscovered, or something subtler? The right to ask certain questions. Questions that no longer feel permitted. Like, what if consciousness did not arise from matter, but shaped it? Or, what if the mind, trained in the right ways, could remember not only this life, but many? Or stranger still, what if the human being was once a portal, not metaphorically but structurally, designed to mirror the cosmos? Alexandria is a wound because it reminds us that someone, somewhere, once believed those questions had answers, and that the answers were written down. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus wrote of scholars who entered the library seeking the structure of the soul, not its theology, its architecture, as if the soul were not just essence but design, a layered, knowable shape. What would it mean to study such a thing? How would one even begin? Maybe with geometry. Sacred geometry was not ornamental, it was functional. A triangle was not just a shape, it was a doorway, a circle, a meditation. The vesica piscis, the point of intersection, was not a diagram but a state of being. What if the scrolls were not meant to be read sitting down? What if you walked them, traced them, sang them? Could knowledge have once required movement? A ritual of posture and rhythm? The idea seems strange to us now. But then again, what isn't? We have trained ourselves to think of knowing as static, to sit still, to analyze, to separate. But in ancient systems, knowing was whole body, music and breath, smell and silence. You became the idea you studied. In such a context, a library was not a warehouse. It was a temple of transformation. And its guardians were not academics. They were initiates, people trained not just in languages and classification, but in states of consciousness. People who knew how to read with the heart, the breath, the bones, and who knew which scrolls required preparation, mental, ethical, emotional, before they could even be opened. This isn't fantasy. There are records from the temples of Philae, from Eleusis, from Delphi, of teachings withheld from the unready, not out of elitism, but reverence. The idea that some truths must unfold slowly, or else they harden into dogma, that the right knowledge, received in the wrong state, can become poison. Could this be why the library had layers? Public wings, yes, for geography, for agriculture, for poetry, but also inner chambers, and perhaps even deeper ones, vaults below vaults, places where texts were not simply stored, but preserved in ritual. Did those texts survive? Or were they the first to burn? We may never know. But absence has its own texture, and some silences feel shaped. You can almost hear the hum beneath the erasure, a pulse where words once lived. There are modern scholars who speculate that parts of the library's collection were translated before the fires, that copies exist in the most unlikely places, not as whole scrolls, but as fragments hidden inside unrelated texts. A Babylonian chart inside a Persian herbal, a lost cosmology quoted inside a medieval sermon, encryption by obscurity, and perhaps some of it lives on not in books at all, but in symbol, in dream, in the way a melody arrives from nowhere and opens a space you didn't know you were carrying. Is that memory? Is that the library remembering us? Because sometimes the act of searching isn't about discovery. It's about invocation, calling forth something that still lingers, not in time, but in resonance. Some believe the library can never be rebuilt, that it was too specific, too sacred. Others say it never truly died, that pieces of it are rebirthing now, in minds ready to reweave the pattern, not to replicate the scrolls, but to restore the questions. To ask not only what was lost, but what do we long to remember? And in that asking, something stirs. A presence, like standing at the edge of a forgotten doorway. You do not know what lies beyond, but your hands remember the shape of the key. You don't need to know the names to feel their absence. The ones who wrote, the ones who read, the ones who remembered. Not just what was stored on the scrolls, but what pulsed between the lines. We've lost them. Not just their texts, but their hands, their breath, the cadence of how they spoke an idea into being. It's a peculiar silence, not loud like tragedy, not sharp like betrayal, just hollow, a stillness too large to ignore, as if someone opened a door and never closed it. And maybe that's exactly what Alexandria was. A door. Not just to knowledge, but to a way of knowing that no longer fits the world we've inherited. A way of learning that wasn't measured in answers, but in depth. In how far down you were willing to follow a thought. In how completely you were willing to let go of certainty. There's a phrase, found carved into the ruins of the Temple of Luxor and later echoed in fragments of Hermetic philosophy, that reads, "Man, know thyself, and you will know the gods." It's a cliché now, emptied by repetition. But what if, at one point, it was meant literally? What if self-knowledge wasn't moral advice, but a map? The Library of Alexandria might have been filled with such maps, interior atlases, manuals of inner cartography, techniques for seeing through the layers of the self. Not psychology in the modern sense, but something older. Something that assumed the mind, the soul, and the cosmos were not separate entities, but aspects of the same unfolding field. Such knowledge doesn't die easily, but it can be hidden. And once it's hidden, it can be rewritten. That's the thing about burning a library. You don't just erase the contents. You erase the authority of what was once known. You make space for a new version of reality to step in. And if that version is smaller, flatter, easier to control, all the better. We forget that power isn't just in armies or gold. It's in who gets to decide what knowledge is called truth. After Alexandria fell, new systems rose, not just in religion, but in education. The trivium replaced the mystery school. The university replaced the initiatory temple. Knowledge became segmented, categorized, credentialed. But something was missing. The unity, the resonance, the idea that all disciplines once pointed toward the same center, the mystery of being. We've tried to rebuild the library in digital form. We now have more access to information than at any point in history. But that's not the same as wisdom. It's not the same as transformation. Alexandria was not overwhelmed by quantity. It was guided by quality. Scrolls weren't collected for trivia. They were collected because each one added a voice to the symphony of existence. There's a story, likely apocryphal but worth hearing, that when Ptolemy III sent envoys to Athens to borrow their copies of Euripides, Aeschylus, and Sophocles, he gave collateral in gold. The scrolls were delivered, copied, and never returned. The originals stayed in Alexandria. The copies were sent back. We're told this as a fact of scholarly ambition. But it raises a different question. How different is the original from the copy? In the ancient world, the act of writing was sacred. It mattered who held the stylus, the alignment of symbols, the breath used in recitation, the ink, the intent. These were not mechanical reproductions. They were transmissions. The copy might look the same, but something was lost. Something always is. So when we say the library burned, we're not only mourning the scrolls, we're mourning the loss of the original voice, the one that didn't need citation to be true, the one that didn't speak to be right, but to awaken. And that awakening wasn't abstract. It was embodied. Imagine stepping into one of the library's halls, not just the shelves, but the space itself. The smell of old papyrus and cedar resin, the geometry of the floor designed to echo the star maps above, the quiet hum of scholars chanting to themselves, not to read faster, but to attune the nervous system. Learning wasn't passive, it was sensory. And somewhere in that architecture you felt it, the presence of something more. Not mystical, not rational, just more. That kind of space can't be replicated by data. It can't be recovered by scanning ancient texts into databases, because what we lost wasn't just the what, it was the how, and more importantly, the why. Why did they collect? Why did they preserve? Why did they care? There's a tendency now to treat ancient curiosity as quaint. We smile at the strange theories, the awkward diagrams. We forget they were building a universe with every line. We forget that they believed knowledge wasn't just a mirror of the world, but a force that shaped it. If that's true, if knowing shapes reality, then Alexandria's destruction wasn't just the loss of memory. It was the collapse of a world view, one in which the universe was alive, and we, its participants. We live in a different world now, one that prizes control over connection. But some part of us still remembers, in art, in myth, in the sudden swell of emotion when standing before a ruin we don't recognize, but feel in our bones. That part doesn't die. It waits. Like a scroll no one's yet dared to unroll. Some silences feel rehearsed. Not the natural hush of time, not the slow fading of memory that comes with age or decay, but an intentional quiet. A silence shaped like a wall, designed not only to conceal but to disorient, to make the seeker question their own impulse to remember. The silence around Alexandria is like that. Not blank, but curated. It's there in the way records skip, in how the names of key scholars appear once, then vanish, in how certain periods of destruction are documented in excruciating detail, and others are left in fog. The fire of Caesar's siege is taught as history. The later razings, by religious reformers, foreign rulers, revolutionary tides, are mentioned only in footnotes, if at all. And yet the final destruction is never clear. No date, no definitive act, just disappearance, which in some ways is even more unsettling, because it implies not erasure by accident, but deletion by design. We speak of the library as if it died. But what if it was silenced? What if it didn't fall all at once, but was strangled slowly over centuries? A book removed here, a chamber sealed there, a scroll misfiled, a teacher exiled, a ritual outlawed, until what remained no longer resembled what had once been, until those who remembered didn't. There is an old Greek word, lethe, the river of forgetfulness. In myth, souls passing into the next life drank from it to forget their past. But it was also used philosophically, as the opposite of truth, not falsehood, but forgetting. Lethe was not a lie, it was absence, the kind that creeps in slowly, the kind you only notice when it's already too late. And perhaps that's the most haunting thing about Alexandria. Not that we lost it, but that we forgot how much it mattered. Imagine, for a moment, that not every scroll was burned, that some were taken, carried east or west, or buried deep beneath shifting sands. There are those who believe fragments survive, in the monastic libraries of Mount Athos, in the coded teachings of Sufi orders, in the dense geometries of Ethiopian manuscripts. Not direct copies, but survivals, ghosts of a vanished whole. And ghosts, as we know, don't fade because they're gone. They linger because something's unresolved. The question is, what? What unfinished truth haunts us still? We know that knowledge in Alexandria wasn't limited to the known world. It reached far. Scrolls brought from India, maps from Phoenicia, calculations from Babylon, fragments of Zoroastrian cosmology, and even tales from lands unnamed, translated, debated, copied again. It was not a Greek archive. It was planetary. Perhaps even planetary in a sense that we no longer understand. A mapping not just of Earth, but of human potential across time. And then it stopped. Or so we're told. But there are oddities. The sudden sophistication of Renaissance thinkers who claimed to dream entire theories, the strange familiarity in alchemical symbols that mirror Egyptian carvings, the way some figures, like Paracelsus, describe their insights not as invention, but as retrieval, as if they were remembering, not discovering. Could these memories trace back to Alexandria, or further? There's a motif that appears in multiple traditions, the idea of a library that was not made by humans but received, a gift, a record left behind. In Sumerian myth, the Apkallu bring knowledge from the deep. In Egypt, Thoth writes the Book of Life. In Jewish mysticism, the Sefer Raziel is whispered to have been given to Adam by angels. These aren't metaphors for libraries. They are metaphors for memory itself, for the idea that knowledge, and real knowledge, comes not from outside, but from within, not learned, but awakened. And maybe that was the core of what Alexandria held. Not facts, but tools for remembering, rituals, tones, texts, geometry, not just for storing data, but for triggering recollection. And if that's true, then what was burned wasn't just a collection, it was a mirror, a map of how to return to what we already know, buried under lifetimes of forgetting. The ancient Egyptians had a word, seshat. It meant both to write and to remember. The goddess Seshat kept the records of the pharaohs, inscribed the architecture of temples, calculated the heavens. But her role was more than scribal. She was the guardian of memory. Not just memory of the past, but memory of purpose. What if the scribes of Alexandria saw themselves the same way, not as archivists, but as stewards of something far older, the soul's memory of itself? And what if they failed, or were forced to abandon their posts? We don't know. But sometimes, when the world goes very quiet, when the distractions fall away, something rises, a question, a whisper, a feeling that somewhere, not far, something is waiting, not to be found, but to be remembered. Maybe that's what the library really was. Not a building, not a place, but a memory that lives in us still. Quiet, insistent, unyielding, and patient. There's a peculiar weight to the idea that something once existed, something vast, sacred, alive, and now it does not. A disappearance not marked by graves, but by questions. Questions that refuse to settle. Questions that follow you in dreams. The Library of Alexandria left no body, no final ruin, no burned-out husk where we could kneel and mourn. It left only the suggestion of what might have been, and sometimes suggestion is heavier than fact. It clings longer. It resists closure. What was so dangerous, we wondered, that it had to vanish without trace? Why has no site been excavated with certainty? Why no full catalog discovered? Why does its story shift each time we try to hold it still? Perhaps because the library was never meant to be found. Not anymore. Perhaps because it was never simply a place. Perhaps because what it held was not just scrolls, but a crack in the narrative of who we think we are. What if the library remembered a version of humanity we were told to forget? A version not built on scarcity, but resonance. Not division, but participation. Where science wasn't separate from the sacred, where words were not used to argue, but to tune, where knowing was measured not in accumulation, but in coherence. We speak so often of lost technologies, but the real loss may be something subtler, something softer, the way a temple's design once changed how you breathed, the way a certain chant aligned your thoughts with the turning of the sky, the way myth wasn't entertainment, but structure. We've inherited broken pieces of that world, scattered glyphs, misunderstood rituals, echoes of meaning stripped from their context. We try to reconstruct, to decode. But what if the code was never linear? What if it was experiential? Imagine a scroll that made no sense until read aloud in a specific room, facing a specific direction, under a certain phase of the moon. a text that revealed itself not through grammar, but through state of consciousness. We would call that mysticism now. But perhaps once it was curriculum. Alexandria may have been the last great place where such learning was still possible. A convergence point, not just of knowledge, but of presence. Where scholars became initiates, where philosophy was ritual, where geometry was not taught on slate, but danced into the body through movement, breath, and sound. Such a place would threaten the world that followed, not just because of what it knew, but because of what it made possible. A sovereign mind, an embodied soul, a living link between the personal and the cosmic. This is not the kind of power empires tolerate. Power, in the modern sense, is control through distance, through specialization, through abstraction. It thrives when people are disconnected from each other, from the earth, from their own interiority. A library that taught the opposite, unity, intuition, wholeness, was never going to survive. So it didn't, or at least not in the open. It splintered, disguised itself, hid inside myths. It traveled through symbols, through architecture, through the instinct of those who felt something was missing and began to ask the wrong questions. Because that's how memory returns, not in declarations, but in doubt. In the quiet voice that says, "This doesn't add up. This story isn't finished." There's a manuscript, barely mentioned in the records, attributed to a monk named Leontios in the 8th century. In it, he speaks of a dream, recurring, persistent, where a voice beckons him down a spiral stair hidden beneath a ruined lighthouse. The pharaohs of Alexandria, by then long collapsed. In the dream, he descends into a vault made not of stone, but of silence. And in that silence, books float, not physically, but in light, in vibration. The dream terrified him. He was taught that such visions were heresy, but he wrote it down anyway, not as confession, as remembrance. He ends the text with a single line: "There are things which hide themselves until we are ready to see." Maybe that's true of the library. Maybe it's still here, not in any one location, but in pattern, in resonance, in the network of questions we cannot stop asking, in the ache we feel for something we've never touched and yet deeply miss. Sometimes you hear that ache in music, in the minor key that pulls your chest open, in the rhythm that bypasses thought and goes straight to the center. Sometimes it's in architecture, a curve, a shadow, a proportion that makes no logical sense, and yet calms the breath, steadies the pulse. Sometimes it's in stories, not the plot, but the moment a character remembers who they really are, and we, listening, feel it too, not as fiction, but as echo. This is the library now, not scrolls, not marble halls, but murmurs, embedded in everything that refuses to forget. A line of poetry that wasn't meant to survive, but did. A symbol that returns in every culture, in slightly different form. A question you asked as a child that no adult could answer. Why are we here? What did we lose? What are we still becoming? These are Alexandria's questions, and maybe that's all that's left. Not the books, not the buildings, but the longing. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough, because longing has gravity, and what we long for often begins to find its way back. Some places aren't remembered because of what happened there, but because of what might have. Possibility has a strange endurance. It resists closure. It flickers even when everything else has gone dark. And Alexandria, in all its mystery, is a city made of that kind of possibility. It is a phantom, a suggestion of a world that once allowed for wonder without punishment, for curiosity without borders, for a way of knowing that didn't have to separate the sacred from the logical, the visible from the invisible. We tell stories about Alexandria because we sense something incomplete in the stories we tell about ourselves. It's as if we live in the aftermath of a sentence that was never finished, and we keep looking backward, not to glorify the past, but to remember the thread we dropped. Sometimes that thread shows itself in the most unexpected ways. A temple relief half erased by time, but still echoing the orbital paths of planets we only recently confirmed. A pattern in a medieval manuscript that mirrors the double helix, centuries before DNA had a name. Or a myth, like the Egyptian story of the Jed Pillar, that eerily resembles the language of spinal energy, nervous system alignment, or what some call kundalini today. These fragments aren't proof. They're invitations. They don't shout, they whisper. Not, "This is how it was," but look again. Alexandria, if it was anything, was the house of those whispers. And perhaps that's why it had to burn, because in a world increasingly arranged around control, whispers can be dangerous. They don't declare, they don't conquer, they suggest, and suggestion bypasses the walls. It moves quietly, through image, through story, through sound, through longing. We like to think of knowledge as cumulative, that what was lost can always be rebuilt, that if we dig enough, scan enough, recreate enough, we will get back what was taken. But some things don't return that way. Some things, when burned, don't leave ash. They leave absence, not an empty space, but a field. Something sensitive, something waiting. You feel it most in questions that have no origin. Why do certain melodies feel ancient? Why do we build in circles when left to ourselves? Why do ruins draw tears from people who don't know their history? Maybe because the body remembers what the mind forgot. Maybe because part of us was built from a blueprint now missing, a design once known, passed down, lived, and then buried. That's the thing no one tells you about forgetting. It has layers. There is what you forget. Then there is the forgetting of the forgetting. And then, eventually, the forgetting of even that, until the only thing that remains is a feeling, a hunger, a pull toward something unnameable, something just at the edge of thought. That's where Alexandria lives now, in that edge, in the moments when you stop chasing answers and simply listen. There's an old Gnostic teaching, found in one of the scrolls from Nag Hammadi, that says, "The one who remembers is greater than the one who knows." It doesn't mean memory is more important than intellect. It means memory holds origin, and origin is power. The library didn't just store information, it stored beginnings, of stories, of systems, of selves. And what was lost wasn't just data. It was the right to remember where we came from. Without that root, we drift. We confuse novelty with progress. We call repetition discovery. We reinvent what we once knew deeply and call it breakthrough. But underneath, something watches. A deeper pattern, older than language, wiser than systems. It's in the way ancient myths align with quantum insights, in the way modern medicine rediscovers plant wisdom the Amazon tribes never forgot, in how our greatest technologies still fail to replicate the intuitive precision of the body or the mystery of dreaming. We're surrounded by echoes, and each echo leads back, not just to history, but to a different kind of human. One who saw learning as a transformation. One who walked into libraries to remember, not to collect. one who viewed knowledge not as control over the world, but as a way to become part of it. That kind of human is not extinct, only hidden, and Alexandria is not lost, only waiting. There's a word used in ancient rites of initiation: anamnesis. It means unforgetting. It's not about new knowledge. It's about recovering what you already carry. About recognizing a truth when you hear it, even if you've never read it. About walking into a space, maybe a ruin, maybe a cathedral, maybe just a room with strange acoustics, and feeling something click. Not with the mind, but with the soul. That's anamnesis. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real function of the library. Not to teach, but to remind, to draw something forth from you that books alone cannot give, to return you to a state of participation, where reading wasn't separate from being, and knowing wasn't separate from becoming. We no longer have the shelves, we no longer have the scrolls, but the field is still here, and memory is patient. It speaks in symbols, in silence, in the parts of you that stir when the world goes quiet. It is strange, isn't it, how some losses feel louder with time. You would think they would fade, like erosion, soft at the edges, worn smooth by distance, but instead they sharpen, they pierce more, not less, as though something about forgetting leaves an open loop, and open loops by their nature demand return. The Library of Alexandria is one of those loops, not closed, not resolved, just pulsing. Not as a ruin you can visit, not as a document you can cite, but as a wound in our collective story, the part where the narrative drops off, where the ink smudges, and we're told to move on, to accept the gap. But not everyone does. Some don't move on. Some stare into the smudge. Some dream of scrolls that never burned. Some wake with languages on their tongue they don't recognize, but ache to speak. Maybe you know that feeling. That strange hunger for something ancient and unspecific. A library doesn't have to be made of stone to live in the blood, and knowledge doesn't have to be read to be remembered. There's a theory, rarely discussed outside the fringes of memory research, that trauma doesn't just erase information. It redirects it. That memories too painful to integrate don't vanish, but migrate. They become sensation, gesture, repetition. They embed themselves in posture, in preference, in instinct. What if something similar happened to civilizations? What if what was lost in Alexandria didn't disappear, but displaced? Not just into monasteries and scroll vaults, but into us, into the metaphors we use without knowing their source, into the images we're drawn to, the stories we retell in every culture, the flood, the tower, the garden, the descent, the awakening. We are haunted by symbols. They follow us, not like ghosts, but like blueprints, half-buried instructions for how to reassemble what was torn apart. In Egypt, the story of Osiris tells of a god dismembered, literally cut into pieces scattered across the land. His consort, Isis, retrieves the fragments, one by one. She reassembles him, breathes life back, not into the exact same being, but something new, resurrected through memory, transformed through grief. It is not hard to see the library in this myth, not just as Osiris, but as the body of a truth once whole, scattered, forgotten, but not gone. And maybe we, like Isis, are gatherers of fragments, the artist who paints in spirals without knowing why, the child who draws a six-pointed star and calls it a key, the engineer obsessed with resonance, the linguist who hears rhythm in language before she hears grammar. None of them carry the whole. But together, something stirs, a shape not yet visible, but forming. This is the part of the story we're never told, that even in destruction there is continuity, not linear, not clean, but real. Ideas don't die because their buildings burn. They mutate, they hibernate, they go underground. Alexandria was not the end of sacred knowledge. It was its concealment. And perhaps also, its seeding. There are teachings. You find them in scattered Sufi lines, in Gnostic fragments, in Vedic whispers, that say true wisdom chooses when to reveal itself. That knowledge has agency, that it waits for readiness, that it protects itself through obscurity until it's safe to be seen again. Could the burning of the library have been not just a tragedy, but a threshold? A moment when the old way ended and the long exile began? A great forgetting, yes, but also the beginning of a longer remembering. The Zohar says, "There is a palace beneath the palace. That beneath every structure lies another, more hidden, more essential." Maybe history works that way too. We know the visible palace, the empire, the battles, the names of kings. But beneath that, a quieter structure, built of symbols, of songs, of stories half remembered. Alexandria, perhaps, was never the top of the mountain. Perhaps it was only a doorway, and the real knowledge was always meant to go further, deeper, inward. We think of fire as loss, but in myth, fire is also transformation. Prometheus steals fire not just to warm, but to awaken. The phoenix burns to be reborn. Alchemy turns lead to gold, but only through heat. So what if the burning of the library was not an end, but a necessary rupture? A way to fracture what had become too centralized, too fragile, to scatter its essence across the world, into stories, into symbols, into us. Perhaps that's why the ache never leaves. Because the remembering isn't meant to be passive, it's participatory. We are not here to mourn the library. We are here to rebuild it, not in marble, not in scrolls, but in the way we listen, the way we wonder, the way we refuse to accept a story with so many missing pieces. The old knowledge will not return in the forms we expect. It will not come with permission. It will not come in the language of authority. It will come as a nudge, a dream, a strange sense of déjà vu when reading a myth for the 100th time and realizing it's not a story at all. It's a memory, not just of the world, but of who we used to be, before the forgetting, before the fire. What happens to a civilization when it forgets that it once knew more? Not in the sense of data or technology, but in the deeper way, in how it sees itself, in how it orients to the stars, to silence, to the space within. What happens when memory is no longer a river, but a wall? There are places in the world where memory still gathers, places that defy their own ruins, the remains of Nabta Playa, aligned with solstices millennia before Stonehenge, the carved spirals of Chaco Canyon, pulsing with solar precision, the step pyramids of Corral, older than any known writing, vibrating still with proportions that echo through sacred geometry. They do not speak in our language, but they remember. They remember in shape, in pattern, in stone. And what they remember may be older than history allows, because history, as we know it, is narrow. It begins when writing begins. It assumes anything before the page is myth, is noise, is nothing. But Alexandria did not make that assumption. Alexandria honored what came before. It did not draw a hard line between myth and science, between poetry and physics, between dreams and design. It saw them all as valid, all as worth preserving, all as different dialects of the same original language, a language that once described the universe in circles, not lines. That's what we lost, not just the texts, but the orientation, the way of seeing in which everything connected. We now parse the world, divide it, classify. But they remembered how to listen to a temple's echo, to a star's repetition, to the shape a breath makes in a cold chamber. In the scrolls, perhaps, were records of that listening. Not just observations, but experiences. Not just facts, but how those facts landed in the body, in the soul, how they reverberated, how they turned to action, how they shaped ethics, rituals, even architecture. What if knowledge wasn't about knowing, but about becoming? Modernity teaches us that knowledge is power. But what if that's not true? What if knowledge was never meant to be wielded, but woven, not to control, but to integrate? Alexandria may have held the last threads of that weaving before knowledge was torn apart and repurposed as a leverage. Power thrives on forgetting. It thrives when symbols lose their context, when sound becomes noise, when myth becomes bedtime story instead of map. So maybe the library didn't just fall. Maybe it was undone, decontextualized, its pieces redistributed not as teachings, but as curiosities, isolated, separated, stripped of ritual, meaning, transmission. And so we inherited fragments, astrology without initiation, sacred geometry without orientation, myth without metaphor. We look at these pieces and wonder why they don't work, why they don't open anything. But keys only open what they're designed for. And without the door, the chamber, the ritual, the breath, a key is just a shape. The loss of the library wasn't only the loss of information. It was the loss of context, the container that made sense of the strange, the resonance chamber in which meaning unfolded. And yet, even in fragmentation, something endures. A rhythm, a scent. The way some ancient symbols still make us pause, even if we don't know why. The way a certain angle of sunlight on stone feels familiar. Recognition without reference. That's memory, too. And perhaps it's the most honest kind, because it doesn't rely on history. It lives in the body, in the dream, in the silence between thoughts. We are taught to distrust that kind of knowing. But what if it's the only kind that never burns? There's a Sufi story of a man who spent his life searching for a lost book. It was said to contain the secret name of the divine, a name that once spoken would restore all wisdom. After years of travel, ruins, scrolls, voices, dead ends, he gave up, sat beneath a fig tree, closed his eyes, and in the silence heard it, not as a word, but as a tone, a vibration that didn't speak to his ears, but to his breath. The book, the story says, had always been within him, but it needed the seeking to awaken. Maybe Alexandria is like that, not a library to be rebuilt, but a frequency to be remembered, a tone, a pattern, something that lives beneath the surface of language, beneath the rubble, beneath our obsession with proof. And maybe, just maybe, that tone is returning, not through scrolls, but through sensation, through the quiet, magnetic pull toward ruins, toward sacred texts we don't fully understand, but read anyway, toward rituals we recreate without knowing why. A hand over heart, a candle lit on a solstice, a circle drawn in the sand. Fragments, yes, but aligned with something deeper, aligned with the possibility that remembering isn't about recovery, it's about retuning, a return not to what was, but to what still is beneath the noise. The library may have burned, but its resonance did not. And if we learn how to listen again, it might still be speaking. There is a sound the earth makes when it remembers. It's not audible in the usual sense, not something caught by microphones or mapped in decibels. It's deeper, slower, felt more than heard. It moves like gravity, like a dream that won't leave you even after you've forgotten its shape. That sound, many believe, still hums beneath Alexandria. Not the city you see on modern maps, but the one beneath it. The layered, half-buried strata of something older, not just in stone, but in purpose. A memory compressed in soil and salt and silence. The ancients knew how to hear it. They didn't call it data. They called it the voice of the land, the breath of time. They listened with their feet, their rituals, their stillness. Alexandria was built in alignment, not only with trade and sea and empire, but with memory itself. That alignment is gone now, but traces remain. Ask the divers who have swum among the submerged ruins just offshore, where remnants of the Pharos lighthouse lie like broken vertebrae on the ocean floor. Ask them if they've felt something down there. Not fear, not danger, just presence. Something watching, something waiting. And what is it waiting for? Recognition, maybe? Or retuning? Some say the library is not lost, only dormant, that it lives in another register, one we've fallen out of, like a frequency no longer picked up by our distracted minds. But still there, still pulsing, still anchored to this world in patterns we haven't yet reawakened. Look closely. You'll see its geometry echoing in places that should have no reason to echo anything. In the proportions of old cathedrals, in the layout of sacred cities, in the timing of certain chants still sung in remote monasteries. They're not copies, they're reverberations. The voice of the library didn't vanish, it scattered. And the question is, how do we gather it? Not through conquest, not through excavation alone, but through attunement. We are used to thinking of knowledge as external, stored in devices, in files, in books on shelves. But ancient traditions suggest something else. That true knowledge, transformative knowledge, requires a vessel, not just a brain, a being. The human, in that worldview, was not a passive reader. The human was the library, a living archive of celestial proportion, bones as resonance chambers, breath as conduit, the spine a ladder of light. Learning was not accumulation, it was alignment. Alexandria didn't only preserve scrolls, it preserved the training, the disciplines, the initiations necessary to receive the scrolls properly. That training is lost, but some of its forms survive. In breathwork, in mantra, in ritual dance, in the strange instinct people feel to sit in certain postures during meditation, never having been taught. Where does that come from? Some say it's biological, others say it's older than biology, encoded, passed down through memory not carried in words, but in vibration. Could the library have understood that? Could it have guarded scrolls not meant to be read, but felt? Encoded in tone, frequency, motion? That would explain why so little survives. Because to copy such texts would not preserve them. To replicate them outside their context would be like trying to transmit music by drawing pictures of violins. And yet, perhaps they live on anyway, not in form, but in impact. A ripple doesn't need the stone to keep moving. There's an account, half dismissed by modern historians, of a traveler in the 12th century who claimed to visit a brotherhood on the southern edge of Egypt. He wrote of chambers filled with symbols he didn't understand, of rituals that used no words, of scrolls he was not allowed to touch. he left with nothing physical. But when he returned to his homeland, he built a chapel whose proportions mirrored the temple he had visited, even though no one in his region could explain the math. He claimed he simply remembered it. The architecture of memory may be stranger than we know. We assume the scrolls were lost. But what if they were never meant to be preserved in objects at all? What if the true preservation happened in those who embodied them? In people who became the scrolls? People trained to carry knowledge not in mind, but in being. Where are they now? Are they gone? Or are they still among us, unrecognized, untaught, misunderstood? Maybe they show up as poets who dream in symbols no one can decode, or as children who intuit star maps they were never shown, or as those who weep in sacred places without knowing why. The human body can forget a name and still carry its echo. The soul, they say, never forgets. And maybe that's why the story of Alexandria won't leave us alone, not because we remember it, but because it remembers us. It remembers the part of us that once walked among symbols, as if through a forest, that once read the sky like scripture, that once knew how to listen so deeply the stars spoke back. That part still exists. It flickers in the quiet. It pulses in the heart when we hear something ancient, something true. It moves when we close our eyes and stop trying to explain. It's what pulls us toward ruins, what draws us to forgotten texts, what stirs when we ask, what if there's more than this? That question is the doorway, and Alexandria is the threshold. Not a ruin, not a myth, a memory, still breathing, still waiting, still calling us back. Some stories never end, not because they continue, but because they refuse to be closed. They unfold in spirals, not lines. They echo. They recur. They haunt. Alexandria is one of those stories. No matter how much we study, how much we analyze, the core remains elusive, not because it is unknowable, but because it resists being reduced. It doesn't want to be solved. It wants to be felt, entered, lived, like myth or memory. And perhaps that's exactly what it is. A living memory, disguised as a ruin. Not a story we tell, but a story that tells us. You can see its fingerprints everywhere once you learn how to look. Not in the facts, but in the gaps. In what's missing. In what no one talks about. In what generations of scholars have quietly agreed not to ask. Like how a site of such renown left behind so little physical trace. Or how an institution said to house the wisdom of the known world became, in official history, a footnote. We are told it burned. Then we are told it burned again. Then we are told maybe it never quite existed the way we imagined. Doubt becomes the new silence. But doubt, too, is a tool. It blurs the outlines. It softens the questions. And in that softness, something slips away. We forget that history is not only written by the victors, it is also erased by the inheritors. And what is erased is rarely what is false. More often, it is what is dangerous. The kind of dangerous that doesn't explode, the kind that unfolds slowly, like a forgotten truth re-emerging in the dark. The kind that changes how you see everything. That's what Alexandria may have held. Not power in the modern sense, not weapons or secrets or blueprints for control, but a power that makes control unnecessary. The kind of knowing that returns you to yourself, to your place in a pattern that includes stars and stones and syllables and silence. We don't know how to speak that language anymore, but we still hear it, in dreams, in ruins, in the strange, aching beauty of a symbol that makes no rational sense, but feels true. We carry that language in our bones. It stirs when we listen. It stirs when we stop pretending that we are separate, that we are alone, that we are new. Alexandria didn't just store knowledge. It cultivated coherence. It brought disparate strands into harmony, astronomy with architecture, myth with medicine, language with landscape. Each scroll was not just a record, it was a thread in a larger weave. And when the weave was broken, something in us unraveled. It's not just that we lost texts. We lost the ability to think in wholes, to feel the relationship between things, to walk through a city and understand that its shape was a teaching, to sit in a chamber and know that its sound was a salve. We call that mystical now, but it was once ordinary. It was once Alexandria. So the question becomes, can it be remembered? Not rebuilt, not reconstructed. Remembered, as in remembered, brought back into body, into rhythm, into presence. That kind of remembering doesn't happen in institutions. It happens in stillness, in practice, in listening to what has no voice, but still speaks, in noticing how certain stories return to us when we're not trying, how certain questions won't let go. Why does the shape of a spiral draw us in? Why do we sense more in the ruins of sacred places than in the monuments of modern power? Why do some people we meet feel strangely familiar? These aren't answers. They're reminders of a different kind of library, not one built of scrolls, but of lives, of moments, of gestures passed down through centuries, a look, a breath, a story told by firelight that carries more weight than its words. That's where Alexandria lives now. Not in proof, in presence, not in fact, in frequency. It's in the way a child draws a triangle and calls it a home. It's in the way an elder sings a song no one taught her. It's in the spaces between our explanations, the ones we try to fill with certainty, but that resist it. Because the truth doesn't always explain. Sometimes it just returns, like a tide, like a tone, like the memory of a place you've never been, but miss anyway. And when it returns, it doesn't ask for belief. It asks for listening, for readiness, for the willingness to unlearn everything that was built on forgetting. That may be the hardest part. We want the knowledge back. But do we want what it asks of us? Do we want to remember a way of being that requires more than intellect? That requires humility, stillness, reverence, not for gods, but for pattern, for breath, for the sound a word makes when spoken with intention, for the silence that follows. Alexandria isn't gone, it's just waiting, not at the bottom of the sea, not beneath the sand, but within the questions we haven't dared to ask fully, the questions that might change us if we followed them to the end. Or perhaps, to the beginning. There is a moment just before sleep, when the world softens, when thought loosens its grip, and memory becomes more like weather than story. Something that moves through you, not something you hold. That is where Alexandria waits, not in the light of day, but in the liminal, in the in-between, between waking and dreaming, between forgetting and remembering, between the story we were given and the one we were never meant to hear. This is not about proof. It never was. The library's truth was never built to survive modern categories. It doesn't answer. It doesn't resolve. It invites. It lingers. It gestures beyond what language can catch. And maybe that's the real secret. That Alexandria was never a collection of scrolls or a building by the sea, but a state of mind. A condition of openness, a willingness to hold paradox, to sit with uncertainty, to let wonder be more than decoration. In the world that followed its fall, such things became dangerous. Certainty became law. Questions became heresy. Systems grew teeth. And memory, wild, luminous, expansive memory, had to go underground. Not disappear, just change shape. You see its trail in the margins of books, in forbidden gospels, in the architecture of old cities that no longer remember why they were built that way, in the melody of chants whose words are long gone, but whose vibrations still bring tears, and in you, in the questions you carry without source, in the symbols you sketch in idle moments, in the quiet grief you feel when you hear that something once existed, vast, beautiful, and gone. That grief is not imaginary, it's ancestral. It is the grief of being born into a world mid-sentence, of waking in a story missing its first chapters, of feeling without explanation that something essential was removed before you arrived. Alexandria is not a place, it is that missing chapter. And something in you remembers, not as fact, as frequency, a hum beneath the noise, a rhythm beneath the timelines. We try to rebuild what was lost with tools unfit for the work. We digitize, analyze, hypothesize. But the library cannot be reconstructed from shards. It was never linear, never logical. It was not an archive. It was an organism, a living synthesis of intellect, myth, sensation, sound, devotion, and sky. To restore it, we would need to become it, to live again as if the world were alive, as if stone spoke, as if breath mattered, as if learning was sacred because it changed you, not just what you knew, but how you moved, how you listened, how you sang. We are far from that. But not as far as we think. Because beneath the layers of forgetting, the design still pulses. In dreams, in rituals we don't understand, but still perform. In ruins that still echo when no one is speaking. In you, sitting here, listening not to be informed, but to remember. What does it mean to remember something that may not have happened to you? Or perhaps the better question is, what does it mean when remembering feels more real than the stories you've been told? Perhaps you were never meant to believe the official account. Perhaps the part of you that doubts is the part that still remembers how to hear. You were told the library burned, that knowledge was lost, that mystery died. And yet, here it is. Alive. Not because someone preserved it perfectly, but because the soul does not forget what it has touched. Because questions, once asked with the whole heart, do not die. Because somewhere beneath politics and empire and ash, the pattern waits. Not to be recovered, but to be heard again. Softly. The way a mother might sing a song her grandmother once knew, though she never learned the words. The way a stone might hold warmth long after the fire is gone. The way you might remember a truth you've never spoken, simply by closing your eyes. This is not the ending. There is no ending. Only a breath, a pause, a moment of silence wide enough to feel the shape of what once was, and maybe what could be again. Alexandria does not want your certainty. It wants your presence. It asks nothing of you except this. When the world grows quiet, when the stories you've been told begin to fray, when the facts fail to soothe, will you still listen? Not for the answers, but for the memory beneath the question, the one that hums, the one that waits, the one that never burned,